learn these things from family, we pick things up and we don't always remember. But I wanted to ask this prompt because I love talking about plants and flowers, but also because I wanted us to start thinking about the plants and nature that's always around us. And we learn tidbits from family, from friends, maybe we don't remember where we learned it, but thinking about the how we understand the natural world around us, how we develop the language to describe the plants around us. Where do they come from? What do they mean for us, for our families, for communities that are native to the lands that we're on? And so I wanted to have that as an icebreaker before leading to Lydia's fantastic discussion about decolonization of archives. So Lydia, if you're ready, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna start actually sharing my screen. Oh, I think it's disabled.
Hey guys, sorry, let me see if I can switch it over to you. Okay, try now.
Okay. Yes, now it works. So you hopefully see my slides now. Perfect. Okay, so excuse me. Oops, sorry about that. Well, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here to discuss my research with all of you. And just a brief overview. This is what I do. I'm a doctoral student at McGill University, and this is what I do in my thesis. So I'm just going to give you a very kind of quick, summarized overview of some of the main things that I look at in my research project. And I have titled today's presentation, The Stories of Digital Archives, a reflection around the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So I actually wanted to start my presentation by telling you a bit about how I came up with the idea of this doctoral thesis. So the biggest challenge that I was facing when I was trying to decide what topic I wanted to explore and what to make my object of study, I really wanted to find a way that allowed me to connect what I consider to be my three big passions, which are Latin America, technology, and non-human species. Not necessarily in that order, but I was really looking at ways in which I could find the connections between these three. And they hold a lot of connections, but it is not always easy to find them, to find that overlapping or that center where they intersect. So there I was, that's me, by the way, trying to find that kind of intersection that would allow me to explore these three topics all together, also with the relationship between them. So as I was going through this research, I was lucky enough to come across the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So some of you might know about the Biodiversity Heritage Library. If not, I really encourage you to look into it. It's a fantastic project. And it is an online library archive that compiles global literature about biodiversity. And it is also an open access project too. So when I came across the Biodiversity Heritage Library, this was actually great news for me. So because this was when I saw how the three of these topics could really intersect in the case of the BHL. And so with that in mind, I decided to kind of make my project a sort of dissection of the BHL as a way to understand how technology, in this case, digital archives and online platforms, communicate and shape our relationships with biodiversity. That is our non-human kin, so non-human species, and also what that meant specifically for Latin America, which is a region that is extremely rich in biodiversity, but that also has a very long history of colonization, and that faces a lot of issues also in terms of access to technology, and you know, issues of the digital divide and access to the internet and so on. Should I stop and read the questions in the chat, or should we leave them till the end?
Whichever you prefer, Lidia.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to keep going, and then we can do the discussion at the end.
Sounds great.
Thank you. All right. So in general terms, I decided that I wanted to look at how intra and interspecies relationships were enacted, curated, and disseminated through the histories contained in digital archives in general terms, but also specifically in the case of the BHL that lent itself so well to that topic. So also, as I was looking at the specific case of Latin America, a fundamental lens through which I would look at those histories inevitably led to the topic of decolonization and the geopolitics of digital archives. So this was as I started to kind of explore these networks of knowledge that that were related both to humans and to non-humans, but that were also embedded in this context of the history of colonization and how it has been translated and permeates still in online digital spaces. So, and this became not only a fundamental part of my research from kind of the academic perspective, but it also echoes my personal beliefs, and it also resonates very strongly with my own positionality as a female Mexican studying and working from Canada. So it was really as well a personal reflection of how, not only how I relate to my non-human kin, but also my own positionality in terms of my human identity. So once I started to look at the digital archives from that kind of storytelling perspective, and I started to look at this storytelling process of stories of both humans and non-humans, in digital archives again in general, and the BHL in particular, I started to ask several questions, and a lot of questions started to come up with when looking at this kind of storytelling. And so I started to wonder, if we are telling stories, whose stories are we telling? Who is telling those stories? For whom are these stories being told? And through what means? So these questions became, might seem simple, but became a key aspect of my research and of my work for many reasons. Sometimes, for example, to demystify ideas of net neutrality and open access, for example, which are so easily assumed when we look at global projects or open access in general. But that becomes really, really essential when we look at that globality from the perspective of marginalized regions and communities. In this case, as I was focusing on Latin America. But also because, as I said, this also intertwines with the presence and the agency of non-human subjects, which is part also of that history of colonization, because non-human species have also historically been exploited and colonized. So we see here that these questions are very, very important when we consider not only that preservation of stories, but also the means for preservation of that stories, as well as the multiple human and non-human actors that are involved, of which we need to keep in mind that when we're asking by whom, only a human minority have actual control over those storytelling mechanisms. So that is why I really started to dig into what goes into that kind of storytelling. And so when I started to consider digital archives as storytelling, I also started to consider the storytelling layers and mechanisms of these digital archives. So in the case of the VHL, we could think of different layers of meaning and different layers of stories and of storytelling. So the first layer we could see are the texts themselves, right? So the materials present in the BHL's collections and the human and non-human stories that they contain. But these texts are not presented in isolation. They are never there by themselves. They go through a process of selection, so they are selected to be included in the catalog, and they are also curated. There is also some information that accompanies them. They do not exist by themselves. And this process adds another layer of stories, which are the stories of metadata and cataloging to those original stories inside the texts. Then if we look at a broader kind of moment of this process of storytelling, we see the ways in which these texts are accessed and the ways in which access to this text is provided. For example, in the case of the BHL, through the library's online platform, through the library's website. And this adds another layer of meaning that also determines who can participate in the storytelling cycle of these texts. So going back to the questions that I was asking before, so who can access this text? That also happens here, and that of course opens avenues for more storytelling for certain groups, but not so much for others. So access is really important to keep in mind as a sort of moment of participation in that storytelling. And then finally, we have this other moment, which is a dissemination of the digital archives. In the case of the BHL, for example, they have a very, very interesting and very heavy presence and strong presence in social media, which is a big source of traffic to the library, and that also engenders more interactions within those storytelling processes. So this adds even more stories to the ones that started with the text. So we're really seeing here that this process that I see as the storytelling of digital archives goes through different moments and accumulates stories as they progress, right? So I'm going to show you an example now to kind of understand this, this process of storytelling, to see how these stories unfold and why it is important to consider all layers. And I think some of you, if you watched or if you were there for my recent presentation with the BHL, might find this example familiar, but it's one that I have been working with lately and that I find it specifically clear to see all of those unfolding of stories. So here I'm showing you an Instagram post shared by the BHL as part of their hashtag for Natural History social media campaign. This was in 2019. And this was a campaign, a very interesting one, that sought to bring to the front and to highlight the contributions of women to the sciences, to the natural sciences, to natural history, as a way to counteract the marginalization of women's contribution to scientific knowledge, historical marginalization of women's work in the sciences. So this blog was part of that campaign, and it features Lina Lois's illustration of Pyrosteia venusta, which is commonly known as orange trumpet vine or flame vine. And this is from Lois's work, Familiar Indian Flowers. And if you can read a bit what it says there, the post also explains that Pyrosteia venusta is a plant endemic to Brazil that is now cultivated globally. So I'm going to try to show you the multiple stories that are happening around this particular species. And we have here a glimpse that is on social media, as I said, in this kind of realm of dissemination. But then if we start to dig into the different stories that are here, we start to find very interesting intersections. For starters, in Familiar Indian Flowers, Lois, the author, actually mentions that this plant is originally from India. So the thing here is that Lina Lois was an Indian-born British illustrator, and this work that you're seeing here, A Familiar Indian Flowers, was published in 1878. However, after digging a little bit in the BHL and the International Plant Names Index, I found that the earliest recorded mention of this species is found in the Botanical Register by Sydenham, Edwards, and James Ridgway, volume 3, which is the one I'm showing you here, which was published in 1917. And in this volume, the authors say that the species under the genus Bignonia, which is the one to which Pyrrhostega venusta belongs, are native from South America. And there they also mentioned that Pyrrhostega venusta was introduced from Brazil to London around the time of publication of the register. And they say that it was becoming very popular there. So I believe what must have happened, or what probably happened, is that this species went from Brazil to London, and as Edwards and Ridgway mentioned, but then was introduced to India through British settlers. And by the time Lois published her book in the late 19th century, it was probably already very popular and even normalized in both countries, which led probably to that blurring of the species origins, and made Lois affirm that it was of Indian origin. So we see here how there are all of these layers and all of these stories really taking place there. And in the different layers too, right? Because this is looking at the texts themselves, as we went from the kind of dissemination level to looking at the texts themselves. And this is particularly important also from the perspective of intersectionality. So as I mentioned, the Her Natural History campaign did a great job at finding all of this marginalized contributions from women to natural history, but we must not forget also the other parts as well, right? Because in this case, Lois was still a white woman, a colonizer, and so that also complicates those stories and those relationships between the humans and the non-humans, but also between different human communities. So now to show you more or less the importance of other layers of storytelling, I'm going to turn to the metadata of Lois's register. These are taken from the BHL catalog. This is Lois's book, Familiar Indian Flowers, and here is the metadata for Edwards and Ridgway's Botanical Register. So first, let us note, if you look at the bottom of the slide, there's the list of subjects, which are obviously different in terms of length. And this could be explained because the way the BHL works is that they collect metadata from collaborating institutions and partners. So that leads to differences in how the metadata is structured, of course. But the problem is that sometimes this can lead to a different interpretation or different meanings that are being communicated through the catalog. So in this case, having this difference in the list of subjects, for example, even if it's unintentional, it could mean a potential different valorization of the work, in this case of female and male authors, for example. If you look at the list, you will see that the subjects for Edwards and Ridgway's register emphasize a lot the pictorial nature of the work. So you can see their copper engraving and engravings and graphic media. So the visual and the illustrations are really emphasized, while Lois's rich illustrations, and let's not forget that Lois was an illustrator, are really not present at all in the metadata. And other than that, so that would be in terms of gender, for example, that in a way could hinder the very purpose of the Her Natural History campaign. And if you also look at this list of subjects, you will notice that there is no mention whatsoever of South America. While it is true that the BHL's Instagram post highlighted the Brazilian origin of Pyrrhostega venusta in a way kind of reversing that omission, the problem is that is not the same. It's not the case in the metadata. And in this metadata, the importance of Brazil as the starting point of the narratives around Pyrrhostega venusta is lost. So in the metadata of these records, as you saw, the geographical affiliations of these two texts are limited to the authors who were British, the place of publication, which in both cases is London, and the holding institutions, which in both cases also are in the US. And the subjects do include India and England respectively as geographical affiliations in terms of subjects. However, none of these affiliations includes liaisons with South America, as I had mentioned, but also the knowledge production that we link and associate with authors, publication, and holding institutions is located exclusively in the global north. While India, which is the only geographical affiliation in the global south, is listed as a subject, that is, it becomes only an object of study. So here we are seeing how different hierarchies continue to be communicated, and that is why we need to stop and think about those stories. Whose stories are we telling? By whom and for whom? In this case, we are still telling stories of geographical, cultural, epistemic, interspecies, and gender hierarchies. And those are the kind of stories that we need to reverse, to try and look to the other side and find room for different stories and diverse stories to be told. So I also wanted to show you another bit of this, going back to the idea of access, right, which is the other layer of storytelling that I look at. And in the case of Latin America, a fundamental part of this has to do with who can actually access this text, right? So if we look at the BHL, I think something that could really be improved is the idea of enhancing the website and the library for mobile access. Also so that it follows the principles of the responsive web. Because as we see in this graph, which is from data from SimilarWeb, the BHL is greatly accessed through desktop devices and not so much through the mobile web. And that, again, could be explained by the fact that the library is not enhanced for mobile access. Now, this might seem a little bit unrelated to what I was saying, but it is actually very, very relevant when we look at the case of Latin American audiences. So according to data from Hootsuite and We Are Social, as of January 2020, Latin America registered very, very high percentages of mobile connectivity. Is one of the regions where mobile connectivity is growing the most in the world. And Mexico and Central America, for example, have 99% of mobile connections compared to the country's total population, while South America registers 106%, which means that individual users often utilize multiple mobile connections simultaneously. So given the importance of mobile devices and mobile connectivity in Latin America, not having an enhanced version of the BHL for mobile devices can decrease opportunities of participation in Latin America. And that also decreases to a certain extent the possibilities of becoming engaged users of the BHL and even help identify and contextualize shortcomings or missing parts or things that could be better presented as in the case of Pierce de Venusta. So we really see here how all of these different elements and different layers of storytelling really intersect, and how we need to dissect them and find the way to make room for more participation, for more diverse participation, and for more diverse storytelling, both from the human and the non-human perspective. So, of course, it's hard to do that kind of tracking of the multiple stories that are taking place across the multiple layers of digital archives and of texts. And this is a monumental task, of course, but it really is imperative that we reflect upon these topics, and as we try to collect, preserve, curate, and disseminate biodiversity-related materials, that we also reflect upon what stories those materials, along with our practices of collection, preservation, curation, and dissemination, are retelling, and which ones at the same time are being concealed or forgotten. So in that context, I would like to finish this presentation with a quote by Donna Haraway that says, "It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what nots, not nots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia.
Thank you, Lydia. That was fantastic.
Thank
I
you.
was taking notes up a storm. I hope that I got all of your references and stuff. That example was fantastic. It really clarified a lot of things for me. I'm struck by how like cumulative the whole thing is. Like each little step reinforces another. As we open up for questions, I want to return to Dana's question. Dana asked earlier, when did you start analyzing the BHL?
It was a while ago. So I think I first came across the BHL probably in early 2018. And I started to, but I was using it more as a resource than as an object of study. So I was actually collecting data from there, but more about the texts. And I was building a corpus because I had a slightly different project back then. I think I started to actually look at the BHL as a product in late 2018. And I started collecting data of traffic and social media activity and the catalog middle 2019, more or less. And I've been collecting data ever since.
Thank you. Dana, did you have any follow-up questions or did that answer it for you? I'm going to assume yes. Heather messaged me. Heather has a question.
I do, thanks, Devin. So Lydia, this is going to be a very messy question, so I hope it makes sense, but I've been thinking a lot about ecological imperialism and the language that we use when we're describing these processes, and it really started to come out when you were talking about storytelling and whose stories are we telling, how are we telling them, and for whom are we telling them. And one phrase that I like is Catherine Yusuf describes it as the grammars of extraction, and how the language we use naturalizes and neutralizes these processes of taking plants, taking people, and how we describe these stories. So having said that, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of language when describing these processes, and how you see the importance of the language that we use for accurately describing these stories?
Right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. That's a very good question, and a big one, a very big one. Also, because I would say that the case of languages is also one that has a lot of layers. So I keep having this kind of onion thinking, because everything, it looks like it has so many layers. And in the case of language, so I look at language also from different perspectives. So at language as it is included in the collections of the BHL. So what languages are there, which are still, the texts included in the library are still majorly in English, which is also another kind of a tie to this idea that I was discussing about open access and these ideas of globality and connection, right? Because we tend to, or we would like to think of digital spaces as democratizing spaces. But then again, English is still the lingua franca of the internet and of digital spaces and technology, and even of code. You know, code is also based on the English language. So we do see this sort of digital linguistic neo-imperialism that is going on with the case of English, right? So I am always a proponent of expanding collections in terms of language. Of course, adding languages other than English, but also non-imperial languages, right? So, and I think the BHL is doing a very good work in terms of incorporating more languages, even if there's still, of course, a lot to do about that. But there is a great selection of texts in languages other than English. But I am also really interested in looking at the representation of, for example, indigenous languages, which are so and unrepresented in digital archives in general, really. Of course, because there are also other barriers to that, because indigenous languages sometimes are not written. There are no written records of indigenous knowledges. There are a lot of them are communicated orally or verbally. So and they were also victims of colonizations, or there was a lot of destruction of indigenous cultural products. So that is one part of what language does, right? And then at the same time, so going back to that kind of English centrality of online spaces, we still see digital archives presented themselves in English, right? So metadata, and of course, you also need them to be, you also need to think about interoperability and other issues that come with technology. But again, that goes back to that kind of centrality of English, right? And even myself, I'm doing this research in English. It's not even my native language, but I'm doing it in English also because of the tools, because of the resources, because the people I can talk to about this research. And English ends up being the one that we have in common and the one that we continue to use, right? But at the same time, we should not let that obscure the presence and the importance of other languages in all of these layers, in the catalog, in the way we disseminate, in the way we curate, in the representation in general of different languages, also because languages are so tied to the representation of cultures. Right? So if we really want to have multicultural, diverse archives, we need to also have multilingual archives. I hope that answers your question.
It did, yeah. The idea of language, there's no, I know I threw a big question at you. There's no like one answer because they're so related. And you know, when we think of like the names of these plants, they're all in Latin, right? And it's like, well, what about, you know, how they were described before that? And it just, the language that the natural world around us is organized, it leaves out so much. And so observing that, thinking about that, challenging that is definitely an ongoing process. So
yes, and also you're right. I didn't mention that, but you're right that also naming non-human species is another process too, right? In which there's also a lot of power relationships involved, and then this historical naming of species is also very much tied to colonization, right? And if you look at colonial texts and you see how colonizers starting to name species. And in the case, for example, of Latin America, there are a lot of texts in which the colonizer mentions that this plant or this animal is called X or Y by the indigenous peoples here, but we're calling it X, Y, or Z, right? And so that process of naming is also another part of it that is more about those kind of interspecies relationships as well in terms of language.
thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions they would like to pose to Lidia? If not, I do. I'm really curious, Lidia. I love that question because I'm definitely I've got some projects right now looking at the language that we use to speak about Indigenous people in medical research, and it's so incredibly complicated. It's tied up in government and law and different cultures coming together and records and people claiming names back, right? And you're right, like you're not only grappling with what people do, but also the record of the infrastructure online that we've created, right? Which changing something, it's like inertia. It takes so much more energy than how it originally got there, right? I almost don't want to shift, but I'm also really interested in how you went from using the Heritage Library initially to studying it as an object and then being invited by them to speak about it. Like how did you become aware of your work and what was that initial reception like?
That's actually a nice story, speaking of stories, in terms of also what the form of connectivity and storytelling that the technology also enables, right? Because I'm often telling people, like, I'm not against any of these things. All the contrary, I think these are very valuable things to do and tools to use, because they can open other avenues. But that makes it all the more important to reflect upon how we do it, and the stories and the connections that it allows. So it actually started, I don't remember exactly when, last year. So McGill, the digital humanities unit at McGill University, which is in the department to which Heather and I belong. So they started sharing, I think, monthly spotlights on the work of graduate students that were doing some sort of research related to the digital humanities. So my research was shared there. I was already working well into my project with the BHL. I was collecting web analytic data back then. So they shared the McGill Digital Humanities section shared the spotlight of my work on Facebook and Twitter. And it was actually on Twitter that I was contacted, like, because I think, I don't remember if the BHL was tagged or something like that. And then that's how they came across my project, and that's how they started to they contacted me actually, and to ask about my project. And so I got in touch with Grace Constantino, who is the outreach communications manager of the BHL, and she got in touch with me. She sent me an email, and she invited me to write a blog post for the BHL's blog, which I think you shared too. So if anyone is interested, and I actually focus a lot more on language in that blog post. So if you're interested in the topic of language, I suggest you take a look. So that happened, and then well, recently, a couple of months ago, Martin, who is actually here, contacted me to invite me to present part of that research and then that information that I had shared in the blog post. Hi Martin, I'm glad you're here. And so I was invited to present that after writing the blog post, to present it at the BHL meeting that happened on Wednesday. So yes, that's and there you see again, right? So I think it's a very interesting and unexpected even, and example of how those connections happen too, right? And that idea of dissemination through social media is also a very interesting part of that. So that's more or less the story of how it happened, and it's also fantastic that that I get to share this with the people at the BHL, and I think these are very, very interesting and important topics to discuss, not only amongst us in like academia, because I'm also very much against staying in academia in this kind of behind curtains kind of thing. So it's been great to actually be able to go out and share that with the people that are actually working on this project. So that's the story.
Wonderful, thank you. If I could ask a follow-up, do you feel like the experience that you've had is unique? Do you know of anyone who is doing studies similar to yours, or organizations that you would, not that I want you to name like, these are the bad actors, but like, do you feel like the experience you've had working with BHL is symptomatic? Is it extra impossible to have those kinds of things?
I would say there's a bit of everything, right? So I was actually very pleasantly surprised by how open the people at the BHL were to listen to what I had to say, and to let me get involved with this in these conversations, which is something that we sometimes do not expect. especially when we are students, I'm still a graduate student and I'm working on my dissertation, and sometimes you don't feel like you can actually reach the people that you're looking at, and that it's also people that you admire, because they're working on these things that interest you and whatnot. So I was actually very, very pleasantly surprised to see that there was this openness to collaborate and to learn about what I was doing. I know a couple of people that in our department that also work with libraries and with other kinds of institutions that have been also able to collaborate a bit. So I think there are institutions and projects that are open to that kind of dialogue, even if there are others that are not, right? Especially when we touch upon these ideas of shortcomings or things that should be changed, things that we don't consider are working. And sometimes you will face those barriers. And I know I have faced them, not with the BHL, but in other instances where people are not so willing to listen to especially when you are going through like the process of critique, and that could be seen as more as an attack instead of an actual kind of constructive criticism, which is what we are trying to do, but it's not always perceived that way. So it's definitely a challenge to find the avenues to actually get people to listen. And in that sense, I would consider myself very fortunate that my work has been well received and that I have been able to reach the people that I wanted to reach from the beginning, right? So, but yes, I do think that I don't know if it's I don't have enough information to say which one is more common, but I would say that definitely there's a bit of luck too in terms of you never know how the people that you're going to try to reach out to are going to react to what you're doing, saying, or exploring.
Absolutely. I would totally agree. I know that that's something that we talk about a lot just as info maintainers. Like a lot of the successes you're able to make seem to be luck and building connections with people, and you can't always plan how that happens so that you can do it every time, right? Heather, did you have any additional questions in absence of any audience questions?
Yeah, I have, I was going to say I have a quick question, but it's probably not going to be a quick question. But thinking about the idea of collaboration, and for those of us, I'm sure Devin can relate, for those of us in information studies who work with faculty members, with archives, with special collections, with libraries, and oftentimes we get so siloed. How, like Lydia, what do you recommend as a way to perhaps break down those barriers, to collaborate, to build those bridges so that stories are able, like there's more people who are invested in telling stories in a much more diverse and accessible way?
Right. Well, again, here this would also depend on your own situation. Your status, your positionality, if you're working for an institution, perhaps you have more resources to reach out directly to people who are doing certain work. To scholars, I'm always encouraging people, or try to encourage people who have the chance to do it, to reach out to scholars outside of their kind of comfort zone. So look at what's being done, even if you don't speak, for example, another language. Look at what's being done in other languages, in other regions of the world, in other communities. Also to open that, to kind of diversify those networks of collaboration. And I also, again, I find that social media is such a big thing right now. And yes, it's full of things, good, bad, in the middle, hard to tell, and weird, and all of this. It's an entirely different cosmos there. But I feel that there is also a lot of people, especially on Twitter, for example, which is where I got in touch with the BHL, that are actually looking for people to work with, to collaborate with. I know after my talk at the BHL meeting, I got contacted by people who are working in natural history collections or in natural museums and whatnot. So I think one big thing, especially if you are not now from kind of the other side, if you're still or not yet in that kind of higher position or not have so many resources, really just kind of make your work visible is also very important. And sometimes you will be surprised at how people actually get interested in what you're doing. And I think just taking advantage of these tools, they're there, and there's a lot that we can do. And so yes, depending on where you are, I think it's both a bit of reaching out and a bit of putting yourself out there. So that others can reach you out. So I think that's how you collaborate, that's how you connect. And you know, it's now that we are living in this kind of digitized world, I think we can really make use of those tools.
Absolutely. Yeah, putting yourself out there and looking for those collaborations, and to totally borrow from Donna Haraway, stay with the trouble and work through those.
Mm-hmm.
So,
exactly. Yeah. And not be afraid, you know, like, yes, there might be people who will not like what you're saying, but that should not stop you from saying it.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Lidia.
Thank you.
We are coming up on time. So Lidia, did you have any final questions for the audience or for us? Do you have any final thoughts you wanted to share?
No, I encourage you to, if you haven't, to visit the Biodiversity Heritage Library, to follow them on social media, because there are a lot of very interesting projects. And I think that kind of intersection between the technology and our relationships with non-human species, which are always virtual too. You know, we relate to a lot of non-human species virtually. I have never seen, I like this example because I love sharks. So I always use that example. Like, I have never been with a white shark. I have no way to have an actual physical relationship with a white shark. And I still love white sharks through images, through texts, through documentaries, through film, through technology. So I think reflecting on that role that technology plays in enabling and determining our relationships with non-human species is something very interesting to think about. And I think the BHL is a very, very nice example of how we relate to those non-human stories through that technology.
Absolutely. Excellent point. Yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lidia. Thank you to Heather, co-facilitator, and to all of the participants.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Lidia.
Thank you, Martin. I'm very glad that you came. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Bye.